My name is Kelly Smith, and I work on navigation and guidance for Orion. As we get further away from Earth, we will pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. It is 2014. Kelly Smith is a NASA engineer, is standing in front of a camera introducing EFT-1, the uncrewed test flight of the Orion capsule. The sentence is about the Van Allen belt's last 10 seconds. In the years that follows, those 10 seconds are clipped, replayed, subtitled into a dozen languages, and shown in thousands of YouTube videos, interviews, and debate programs. In a 2026 interview, filmmaker Bart Sibrel plays the clip for his host and says, "He just said that the technology to go through the radiation hasn't been invented as yet of 2014. He then asked the question that is the heart of this entire episode. How could NASA have done in 1969 what one of its own engineers says in 2014 still has not been solved? These are 10 of the most frequently quoted seconds in modern moon landing skepticism, and they are a perfect example on how difficult it can be to determine whether a statement proves deceptions or merely describes a completely different task from one of the people assume. That is what this episode is going to investigate today. This debate might have remained in the shadows of better known arguments: the flag, the stars, the shadow, if reality hasn't caught up with it. At 10:35 p.m. UTC in April the 1st, 1926, Artemis 2 lifted off from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. On board were the NASA astronauts Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, and Christina Koch, along with Jeremy Hansen of the Canadian Space Agency, traveling inside the capsule Integrity. It was the first time since Apollo 17 in December 92, more than 53 years ago, that human beings have been traveling beyond the low Earth orbit and therefore through the Van Allen belts. On April 10th, 1926, the capsule splashed down in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego, and all 4 astronauts returned safely. For the first time for more than a century, the question of the Van Allen belts are no longer only an historical questions about what happened between 1968 and 1972. It was a question the world has been just watching being answered again in front of open cameras with living astronauts who could be interviewed afterwards. And as we will see in later part in this episode, that particular detail, the splashdown of the San Diego, contains an ironic twist that few of Schiebel's own followers probably anticipated. But before we get there, we need to understand what is in the Van Allen belts actually are, and that the argument came from, and why its supporter find it so convincing. The story of the Van Allen belts does not begin with spaceflight. It begins with the Aurora. In 1895, the Norwegian physicist Christian Birkeland proposed that Earth's magnetic field could trap electrically charged particles from the sun and direct them towards the pole, where they created the aurora. It was a speculative idea at the time, but it pointed in the right direction. It is in the early 20th century Austrian physicist Victor Hess also discovers cosmic rays, high energy particles from the outer space that constantly bombarded Earth. The man who gave the belt the names was James Van Allen. He was rejected by the U.S. States Navy during the Second World War because of a heart condition. Instead, he worked on developing proximity fuses for ammunition. After the war, he simply built inexpensive rockets called Aerobees, which were launched from balloon platforms as a part of what was informally known as the Raccoon program. Their purposes was to measure radiation high in the atmosphere. On January 31st, 1958, the United States launched the first satellite, Explorer 1, as a rapid response to the Soviet Union's Sputnik, who shocked the year before. On board was a Geiger-Müller counter built by Van Alen's team. The instrument recorded something strange. A certain attitude, the account rate suddenly fell to zero, not because there was no radiation, but because there was so much radiation that the counter became saturated and stopped functioning properly. In Explorer 3 and 4 confirmed the suspicion the same year and mapped what turns out to be two distinct belts of trapped radiation surrounding the Earth. Interestingly, the Americans was not alone making the discovery. The Soviet satellites Sputnik 2 and Sputnik 3 carry similar instrument built by the physicist Sergei Ivanov, and Soviet scientists reached broadly similar conclusions as approximately at the same time. Several of the Russian sources used in the research of this episode emphasize this historical detail, which is well documented independently of the American accounts. The belts are shaped roughly like two donuts surrounding Earth, held in place by the planet's magnetic field. The inner belt extends from the altitude of roughly 600 to 1600 kilometers to approximately 9,600 to 13,000 kilometers and consists of primarily high-energy photons. The outer belt is typically located between 13,500 kilometers and 19,000 kilometers and extend as far as approximately 40,000 kilometers out in space. It consists of mainly electrons. Between the two are a relatively empty slot region, and closer to Earth it is known as the plasmasphere. The belts are not static. Solar storms can temporarily alter the shape of and the size and intensity in dramatic ways. That was demonstrated clearly in 2012 and 2013 when NASA's two Van Allen probes launched specifically to study the belt in detail, discovered that a solar storm had temporarily created an entirely narrow third radiation belt between the two known belts. It remained in place for approximately 4 weeks before another solar storm erased it. The discovery was presented at a NASA press conference by researchers involved in the mission, including Sri Kanal Sasha Urkosowski at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory and David Slibreak of the NASA Goddard. They explained that one of the mission's instruments, REPT, has been switched on earlier than planned so that its observation could overlap with those from the older SAM-PEX satellite. That coincidence made the discovery possible. It was a concrete example on how belts with more than 55 years after the discovery could still surprise the scientists who have spent their entire career in studying them. That is the established physics, and it is precisely the complexity, the invisible radiation, fluctuating intensity, and measurements expressed in rads and rems, unit most of us never had anything to think about, that makes these belts so fertile for the ground of doubt. If you look at the first cracks in this theory, that is that the doubts surrounding the Van Allen belts did not emerge in a vacuum. Its root goes back to the 1970s and Bill Gates' original claims that the Apollo program has been staged. But the argument took a technical life of its own when filmmaker Bart Sibrel's 2001 documentary A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. The 47-minute film claims, among other things, that Sibrel discovers a NASA footage showing astronauts simulating a journey to the moon from low Earth orbit. In the film, and through the following decades on his website, Sibrel.com, the radiation belt had remained one of his central recurring arguments. But what truly gave the argument new life was Kelly Smith's 2014 statement, the one we heard in the start. The clip circulated for years within smaller, should we say, skeptical communities. It gained far wider exposure when Sibrel began using it in major interviews, including the appearance in the Joe Rogan Experience in 2024. A segment dealing specifically with the Van Allen belts has been shared separately and viewed by millions of times. For the first time, a NASA official quotation has been connected directly to the radiation issue in a way that appears immediately contradictory. How could a NASA engineer said in 2014 that the challenge of sending people through the belt must be solved, if people have already done so 6 times between 1968 and 1972? As the Artemis program moved forward in 2025 and 2026, and a crew flight approached, the question became relevant again. Sibrel returned to it in new interviews, including an episode of the Ryan Files, recording shortly after the landing of Artemis 2 in April 26, as well as a public television debate in Piers Morgan program, where he faced opposition from, among others, Apollo 16 astronaut Charlie Duke. This is where we need to encounter the argument where it's strongest and most thoroughly developed from. Now let's give the theory the fair treatment that we promised. Not a straw man, but the actual quotations, the actual figures, and the actual logic used by its best-known advocates. The starting point is NASA's own quotation. The core of the argument is Kelly Smith's 2014 statement. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. Sibrel's point is simple and rhetorically striking. A NASA engineer is speaking in the present and future senses, not in the past senses. He does not say we solved this in 1969. He says that this challenge still must be solved before people can be sent through this region. To a listener who does not actually know the technical content, it sounds like an admission. Then we have the circularity argument. Sibrel's next step is an attack on the very basis of NASA's safety features. When critics of his theory point out that the Apollo astronauts' total radiation dose was approximately 16 sorry for my pronunciation, during 68 minutes of the passage, which converts into roughly 14 rads per hour, well below the level of 300 rad per hour that the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration considers lethal. He raises a fundamental question about sourcing. How do we know that? Because the people who faked the moon landing said so. What is the source of this? NASA. His point is that if NASA already suspected of lying about the journal itself, NASA's own measurements cannot be used as proof that the journey was safe. According to Sibrel, that would be using the accused party as its own witness. Then we have the shielding. One of the most specific technical claims concerning is the thinness of the Apollo capsule's shielding. According to information Sibrel cites in his own interviews, the shielding surrounding the astronauts consisting only of 1/8 of an inch aluminium. In his comparison, that provided less than half the protection of the lead apron used during an ordinary X-ray dental. The difference, he points out, is that an X-ray machine emits radiation for only a fraction of a second, whereas the astronauts would supposedly have spent hours inside a belt with far greater radiation intensity. Sibrel also refers to an American television segment from the 1950s in which researchers sent space probes equipped with Geiger counters through the newly discovered belts. According to his description of the footage, which he has posted on his own website, the measurement shows 100 times the lethal dose, and the radiation is so intense that it caused the Geiger counter itself to vibrate violently and break. For Sibrel, this represents one of the earliest and most innocent data points in the story. It was recorded long before anyone was debating accrued lunar travel, and therefore, in his view, the most difficult to dismiss as propaganda. Finally, Sibrel points out where he sees as the logical tension within the timeline itself. How could a problem that NASA engineers said in 2014 has not yet been solved have been solved in 1969? Using a far less advanced technology and apparently has been forgotten and lost afterward. In his interviews, he expressed this through a rhetorical shape analogy. It would be like inventing the automobile, throw it into the ocean, and then having reinvented half a century later. Why this argument is so powerful to its supporters? Because unlike the argument about flags and stars and shadows, it does not require anyone to personally analyze a photograph. It requires only that the listeners hear the official quotation from a NASA employee and trust their own sense of what the word means. It feels like quoting an authority against itself, which for many people is the most convincing form for evidence there is. That is, the argument sounds like when it's presented at its strongest. Now let's look into the territory of where it becomes more speculative. Now we need to go down the rabbit hole, because if we continue the tale beyond the radiation arguments, we quickly encounter far more dramatic claims in the same source material. In his interview, Sibrel says he spoke with the widow of the astronaut who was supposed to become the first man on the moon. In context, this appears to reference to Gus Grissom, who died in the Apollo 1 fire in January 1967. According to Sibrel's account of the interview, the widow said that her husband was murdered by CIA because he would not cooperate with the Apollo program fraud. Sibrel emphasized that they were her words and not his interpretation. The same source material also include an anonymous, allegedly filmed deathbed confession. A man tells his son in 1968 he witnessed the moon landing being filmed inside two connected black-painted hangars in the Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico. At the same time, he confessed to killing a colleague in order to keep the operation secret. Then there's also a numerical interpretation of the Artemis program itself. The Saturn V rocket and its newer version of the story, the Artemis' own launch vehicles, is said to be 322 feet tall. That is the same number used in the logo of Yale University Secret Society Skulls and Bones, which has counted several U.S. presidents among its members. The name Apollo, the Greek god of sun and light, is also connected to some interpretations to Apollyon, the angel of destruction, mentioned in the chapter 9 in the book of Revelation. Finally, Sibrel introduced an asteroid prediction into its most recent versions of the story. According to Sibrel, a Christian man who died and came back to life 30 years ago had a vision of an asteroid named Artemis would strike the ocean off the coast of San Diego. NASA confirms that Artemis is real, named near-Earth asteroid that will pass unusually close to the Earth on April 13, 2029. Sibrel presents the vision as a possible evidence of that the government either knows about or intends to deliberately cause a catastrophe in order to distract attention from the question about the moon landings. It is worth noting, without drawing any conclusions about what it means, that Artemis 2 did in fact splash down in the ocean off San Diego in April 26, 3 years before the predicted asteroid date. It is a striking coincidence that two stories that would otherwise have no documented connection. This episode takes no position in what is beyond the acknowledgement of the coincidence exist. What is important to notice there is how differently these various lines of evidence should be weighed. The interview with Grimson's widow is a documented named source, but its central claims that Grimson was murdered by the CIA is not supported by any forensic or official investigation. NASA's own accident review board concluded that the fire was caused by an electrical fault in a pure oxygen environment. The deathbed confession is anonymous and cannot be independently verified. The numerology is based on loose associations between numbers and symbols without any documented causal connection. And the asteroid prediction is a personal religious vision that cannot be scientifically tested until 2029 at the earliest. So how does the full content shown? What does the independent data show, and what did Artemis 2 actually demonstrate? If we look at the Kelly Smith quotation in its full context, the central quotation comes from a public NASA video about EFT-1, the uncrewed 2014 test flight of the Orion capsule. It was not a general statement about humanity's ability to cross the Van Allen belts. According to analysis of the clip's broader context, Smith was specifically speaking about validation of a new modern spacecraft, its electronics, its shieldings, and design limits before it could be certified to carry human beings. He was not expressing renewed doubt whenever the humans could survive the passage of all. NASA's own official pages also states explicitly that the Apollo 8 in December 1968 was the first crew spacecraft that traveled beyond the Van Allen belts and continued to the moon. That historical claim does not conflict with the engineers in 2014 still needing to verify systems of an entirely new spacecraft designed for a new generation of missions. If you look at what James Van Allen, what he said himself, the man whose names the bells carry, was asked about this theory after it was presented in an American television program. His response, preserved in publicly available email correspondences, was this. The recent Fox TV show, which I saw, is an ingenious and entertaining assemblance of nonsense. They claim that radiation exposure during the Apollo missions would have been fatal for the astronauts is one of its examples of such nonsense. He elaborated with specific figures. Because of the height of the velocity, the astronauts spent only about 15 minutes inside the inner belt and less than 2 hours inside the less penetrating outer belt. The resulting radiation exposure of the round trip is less than 1% of a fatal dose. Then we have the actual measurement. Every Apollo astronaut wore a personal dosimeter through the mission. The measurements were published at the NASA's Apollo Experience reports on radiation protections. Apollo 8 and 7 measured 0.16 rad. Apollo 9 measured 0.2 rad. Apollo 10 measured 0.48 rad. Apollo 11 measured 0.18 rad. Apollo 12 measured 0.58 rad. Apollo 13 measured 0.24 rad. Apollo 14 measured 1.14 rad. The highest recorded dose, because the landing on the Frau Mauro Highlands required a dictionary that passed closer to the inner belts. And then we have Apollo 15 that measured 0.3 rad. For comparison, NASA's Mission Operations Directorate has established a limit of 400 rads for skin exposure and 15 rads for the blood-forming organs over the full mission. At the time, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission allowed occupationally exposed workers to receive as much as 5 rem per year. This measured doses is therefore comfortably below the safety limits used at the time and not even close to them. So why is these figures is not as contradictory as they sound? Sibrel's comparison with OSHA threshold of 300 rads per hour is mathematically correct. 16 rad over 68.1 minutes correspond to approximately 14 rads per hour below, which is well below 300. But the relevant comparison of the total dose received during the actual passage is not. I'll take it again. But the relevant comparison of the total dose received during the actual passage and not in an extended, should we say, hourly rate. The astronauts does not spend a full hour at its point of maximum intensity. They spend roughly an hour in total passing through the most intensive regions. The spacecraft metal is also providing shielding through the passage. According to independent analysis of radiation data of the Apollo trajectory, the command capsule shielding produced an alternation factor of approximately 10, comparable to 7 millimeters of lead. The claim that the shielding consisting of only 1/8 of an inch of aluminium and providing less protection than a dental X-ray apone probably refers to the lighter outer wall of the Orion capsules rather than the complete Apollo command module. Apollo has a much thicker, multi-layered structure, including a heat shield, pressure hole, and interior panels. The relevant comparison should therefore involve the spacecraft's total effective shielding through the passage and not the insulated thickness of a single exterior panel. If you look at the independent calculations, a YouTube astronomer and science communicator Scott Manley calculated that the radiation's exposure using ESA's official's SPEN-VIS radiation model. His figure shows that an unshielded radiation near the most intense part of the belts, approximately 3,000 kilometers above the equator, can reach as much as 26,000 rads per hour. That is an extraordinary high figure, and at first glance it seems to appear to confirm the danger. But with shielding equivalent of 7 millimeters of aluminium compared to a real spacecraft hull and verified against actual sensor data from the uncrewed Lunar Orbiter 1 probe, the figure falls below to approximately 20 miles per hour. And because the Apollo missions follow an inclined trajectory of approximately 35 degrees deliberately to avoid the most intense regions of the belt and pass through at high velocity, Mandy calculated that the total one-way dose of approximately 0.18 oil. That is a very close match to the actual Apollo 11 measurements. Interestingly, there is one issue that advocates of the conspiracy theory and NASA's own scientists agree of the underlying physics. On July 9th, 1962, the United States detonated a nuclear weapon high in the atmosphere in a test called Starfish Prime. Instead of weakening the belts, the explosion injected artificial high-energy electrons into them. This temporarily made parts of the inner belt far more intense than normal, intense enough to destroy several satellites operating at the time, including Telstar 1. This is a general example of the belts is not being fixed or static. It also demonstrates that the NASA engineers in the 1960s were fully aware of the intensity of the belts could vary dramatically. The exact kind of knowledge used to design the Apollo trajectories. If we look at the closest that it ever comes to going wrong, then on August 4th in 1972, between Apollo 16 and 17, a powerful solar storm struck the space surrounding Earth. Had a crew been traveling to the moon at that time, the radiation dose would probably have been severe and possible life-threatening. That is one of the clearest acknowledgments in NASA's own historical record that the Apollo program benefits from the element of luck in its own timing. But that does not change the fact that the missions all took place outside periods of extreme solar activity. Then we have the contribution from, should we say, Russian explanations. Several of the Russian sources I used in this episode were produced independently of the NASA and begin from a, should we say, generally skeptical position towards American spaceflight theory and history. Nevertheless, they offer broadly consistent physical explanations. Earth's magnetic axis is offset from its rotation axis, creating weaker corridors of the belt structure that can be used by a careful calculated trajectory. The spacecraft's own magnetic tails, as well as its surrounding plasma conditions during the long gradual transition to the moon, as opposed to satellites that constantly orbit inside the belt, is also significantly reduced the total exposure time. And then there is the Artemis 2. In April 26, 4 living named astronauts, Weissman, Glover, Koch, and Hansen, traveled through the exact physical region that has been the center of this debate for more than 20 years. They follow a trajectory designed specifically to minimize the time that they spend in the most intense part of the belt, as the Apollo missions has done. They returned safely to Earth and landed in the Pacific 10 days later. None of the official mission reports mention radiation injuries or unexpected exposure levels as a problem. There is no mathematical proof that every historical Apollo figure is correct to the final. I take it again. That it is not a medical proof that in every historical Apollo figure is correct to the final decimal place, but there is a direct, modern, independently verifiable demonstration that the basic task send humans through the Venetian belts and bring them home alive can in fact be accomplished using modern technology under continuous public observation. So, what actually holds up? Let's sort through the claims. The Van Allen belts are real. They pose a documented radiation hazard to unprotected humans and electronics. NASA engineers continues to work actively with validating shielding and trajectory choices for new spacecraft, such as Orion. All of that belong in the category of well-documented facts. It's basic physics confirmed by independent measurement from space programs of multiple countries since 1958. The actual measured radiation doses received by the Apollo astronauts is between 0.16 and 1.14 which is far below the safety limits used at the time. James Van Allen himself rejected the claim that the radiation would have been fatal and supported his position with specific features. Those conclusions are also well documented and is based on publicist primary data and not merely on NASA Plus releases. Kelly Smith's 2014 statement most likely referred to specifically validating the Orion capsules for future missions rather than admitting that humans had never crossed the belts. That interpretation is supported by a variable context surrounding the quotation, or through a complete verbatim transcriptions of Smith-Full's presentations was not available to me during the research of this episode. The fact that the crew of the Artemis 2 traveled through the belts in April 26 and returned safely is well documented by multiple independent news sources and NASA's public missions coverage. Bart Sibrel's circularity criticism, the one that could not be uncritically accepted as its part zones figures as proof for the same part's innocence, is in itself a valid principle of source criticism. However, the conclusion he draws in this case is not supported by independent cross-checks that exist outside NASA itself, including Van Allen's own response, Scott Manley's independent calculations, and data from spacecraft operated by other countries. The claim that 1/8 of an inch aluminium provides less protection than a dental X-ray apron is weakly supported in the form in which it is presented. It is probably the result of a confusing thickness of a single panel with the spacecraft's total effective shielding. The stories about Grissom's alleged murder by the CIA, the deathbed confession involving Cannon Air Force Base, and the Illuminati numerology surrounding rocket height are all speculative or weakly supported. They rely on anecdotes, unnamed witnesses, and loose numerical associations without forensic or documented support. It's also directly contradicted in NASA's public available investigation into the Apollo 1 fire. The predictions involving Apophis in 2029 is entirely speculative in relation to the Van Allen debate. Apophis itself is real and is well-documented asteroid, but the connection between it, a personal vision, and the moon landing debate cannot be scientifically tested. So, where does it leave us? At its strongest, the Van Allen argument is one of the most technical sounding of them all, of classic objections to the moon landings. It does not require the listener to examine a photograph and a form of a personal opinion about shadows or stars. It is simply ask the listeners to trust their own intuitive understanding of a single 10 seconds quotations from a NASA employee. And this is precisely why context, who was speaking about which spacecraft and under what circumstances, that makes all the difference between a revelation and a misunderstanding. James Van Allen himself, the man whose life work gave the belts their name, used the word nonsense to describe the claims of the radiation would have killed the astronauts. He did not say it was a government official He does not say it as a government official, but as a scientist who quite literally is among the best qualified people in the world to judge how wrong he believed the claim to be. At the same time, Bart Sibrel's basic source critical instinct deserved acknowledgement. The idea that we should not be uncritical, accept an organization's own figures as definitive proof of its own innocence, is in principle which science itself depends. The difference lies in whenever we are willing to accept independent cross checks when they are available, calculation performed by other physicists, spacecraft data gathered by other countries, and now, most recently, 4 living astronauts making a publicly observed journey through the exact same region of space. Artemis 2 landed in the Pacific in April 26. Bart Sibrel, according to his own statement, remained convinced that even that mission was staged. And somewhere in the middle are the rest of us, in which we access more and more primary resources than ever before, and the choices we have to draw the line between, should we say, healthy skepticism towards the authority and a conclusion that remained fixed regardless of what new evidence emerged. And this is where I leave you today, not with proof, but with a question. How much new evidence should actually be taken into account before a theory is willing to change? And speaking of an eighth of an inch, I promise that our next time I will calculate rads, rams, and empirical units all at once. Next time it will not be about kilometers and sieverts, I promise. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next episode.